Thank you for a wonderful introduction, which will resonate for a long time. And thank you even more so for your efforts informed by hard-learned experience in the arena of guardianship. And I'm so glad I connected with you not that many months ago to a quote, and we'll get to some of this soon enough. But since then, you have helped me so much in a in the non-vernacular sense, a very wicked subject that I'm going to be grappling with. And I know that you are writers helping writers, and I never thought of myself as a writer until this campaign started in around 2006. And so, thank you so much. I'm digging deep on investigative reporting and the guardianship crisis. And let's see, how I advance. I'll do that. Attention is the currency of our most personal relationships. To gain and maintain your attention over having you take notes or take screenshots. What I'm going to do after later on tonight is I will post my talk as a PDF file. Basically, this is a PDF file. So what you see is what you get. And anything underlined is hyperlinked to resources. And so please consider this. Oh, hold it. Oh, here, it's being a little, sorry, I'm just scrolling. Please consider these sections more as a menu. And so what we've got here is some of the things I'm going to be talking about. And Leonie, I appreciate you sort of didn't have to give a spoiler alert. I love your introduction, the way you sort of piqued everybody's interest without. And so I won't give a spoiler alert. I always wonder why there's not trigger warnings, not for audiences, but for speakers. So let's see how I do on that front. But this is a menu. What you can do is when you get this PDF, you can navigate back and forth through all the sections and through all the pages. And on the upper right, which may be not quite just visible, here on the upper right is a sort of globe, and that'll bring you back to this page. Otherwise, it's just going to be too much for you. So I've got a lot of material. I'm going to go through this really quickly. Think of yourself as standing in front of a restaurant, glancing at the menu. And maybe people are coming in and out, and you have wafts of amazing food substance coming out. But basically, you'll need to delve into this for real nourishment. So this is more of an appetizer. I am not a stranger to the Southwest, and most certainly New Mexico. My family ended up in New Mexico at the turn of the century, circa 1900, in Mogollon, mining. And one of my relatives, Ernest Craig, ended up with the Last Chance mine there, and also the Ernestine Company that had other mining interests. And that was named after his daughter, my cousin / step grandmother, or something like that. And Ernestine ended up buying the view in the upper right, the Mimbres Hot Springs in the Mimbres Valley near Silver, which here is just looking up to the Gila, not the wilderness, but the Gila National Forest. In the late 70s, I was in Albuquerque and started my career in historic preservation, restoring the Gustav Baumann designs at the Old Main Library. I wish I had taken my $1,000 I get paid for that and bought a few Baumans, but I needed it for rent. So that just didn't happen. Meanwhile, more recently, since 2020, I've been out west a lot for months. Most recently in Wyoming, but a lot of times in Utah, but always back to New Mexico, especially the Gila. Brooke Astor was my grandmother only for the last half of her century long life. Her father was a career officer and ended up being commandant of the Marine Corps. But early on, at the turn of the century, from age 8 to 11, my grandmother lived in Beijing, where she met Bui, the last emperor. She married Vincent Astor in 1953, and Vincent died in 1959. And what had happened is Vincent Astor set up the Vincent Astor Foundation in 1947 for the alleviation of human misery. While the all-male board said, well, Mrs. Astor, or well, Brooke, you can just go, I don't know, take the baths in Baden-Baden or something like that. She said, I'm going to assume presidency. I've been involved. I'm going to continue to be involved. And she became president in the early 60s till 1997. And to further the mission of the foundation through what was in the 60s beyond would be called sort of much more engagement with addressing the quality of life. So in 1962, 3 years later, after Vincent's death, 2 years after she started the foundation, she became president of the foundation. She wrote Patchwork Child about her peripatetic patchwork childhood. You would think she'd be ready to retire and steeped in nostalgia, but not so. This was just the beginning of 4 decades as a senior advancing the cause. So here she became president in 1960 to further this mission, addressing the quality of life. She gave through the foundation and its board, she and the foundation gave to large civic jewels, the civic jewels of New York City, here the New York Public Library, the Pierpont Morgan, and the Metropolitan Museum, and others. But her really favorite projects were small not-for-profits in communities, where in many cases, through the due diligence of the Astor Foundation, both the funds were given, but also an Astor seal of approval, which helped gain greater investment from others. For many organizations, many still sustained. My grandmother was a philanthropist in this capacity for decades, and New York's grande dame, and a humanist aristocrat with a good heart. At age 96, in 98, she was given the highest civilian honor in the country, the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton. At 100, David Rockefeller, the senator second from the left, gave my grandmother a birthday party at Pocanico, which is up the Hudson, sort of the Rockefeller compound, and there were 100 people there, and so here's some cakes at the party. She loved hats. What can I say? And so after that, she pretty much disappeared from the limelight. That is until my guardianship petition, which was to have been sealed, was discovered by the press. Leading to front page headlines reading, "Disaster for Mrs. Astor." My grandmother would never want to be known as one of America's most famous cases of elder abuse, nor did she, while in the throes of dementia, seek to be victimized, deprived, manipulated, and robbed in what the Manhattan DA later described as a calculated scheme to defraud. But through my grandmother's incredible ageless attitude, and I hope that this is her legacy more than anything else to advance elder justice. My guardianship petition was to have been sealed. It's quite obvious that Helen Peterson grabbed it off some file pile in the court and made it a front page headline before it had been sealed. But there were efforts, and the judge, after the expose or by the leaked, so to speak, file, uh, and uh, a number of articles by the New York Daily News. It was the whole file was put under seal. At that point, what happened is news organizations, including the New York Times, Daily News, and the Post, and others, moved to vacate the order. And their contention was my grandmother's well-known and respected public figure, and this is much of a public interest as a most extreme example of potential elder neglect and mistreatment that is possible among all members of society. And what the press is saying here in their appeal is basically this can, if and what's been echoed cross country as I tour around is if this can happen to broadcaster, it can happen to anybody. My grandmother, as you know, wrote Patchwork Child in '62, and then a couple decades later wrote Footprints, an autobiography. In the press's appeal, they reference her 2 volumes of memoirs and note that she was very open and forthcoming about her first marriage to John Dryden Cruiser, which was punctuated by her husband's alleged physical abuse, alcoholism, and adultery. And their feeling was that she was open with these issues, and she would, if she was cognizant, be equally open with the issue of abuse. What's equally interesting, and perhaps even more so to you all, is that she wrote 2 novels. In '65, early one, The Bluebird is at Home, and a couple decades later, The Last Blossom on the Plum Tree. The themes and character elements in her fiction involve older women navigating loss, privilege rendered as graceful yet morally fragile, wealth as a moral test that exposes rather than ensures virtue, and affluence that breeds betrayal when empathy fails. The judge eventually opened my grandmother's files, save medical files and elements, and the press was on. I became an accidental author or co-author with my lawyer of my guardianship appeal, which viewing some of your archived presentations, I suppose is something of a pitch, but in a very different sense. And here's my appeal that I filed in July that was lifted by Helen Peterson. What I'm saying, in partnership, obviously, with my lawyer, was that the sad and deplorable state of my family's affairs has compelled me to bring this guardianship action because my father has turned a blind eye to her intentionally and repeatedly ignoring her health, safety, personal and household needs while enriching himself with millions of dollars. Her medical and dental care are substandard, and her diet is inadequate, and needed prescriptions are inexplicably stopped. And she's been forced to live among peeling and falling paint and dusty and crumbling carpets. Her bedroom is so cold in the winter that my grandmother is forced to sleep in the TV room in torn nightgowns on a filthy couch that smells probably from dog urine. Spurred by Helen Peterson's revealing of my otherwise sealed guardianship, it became evident that our battle was on two fronts. We had the official front in court, and we had the cause to create the narrative of what was happening and our aspirations through the media. Our official engagement here was in large part because David Rockefeller, who helped in so many ways, and Annette de la Renta, Oscar de la Renta's wife, who was my grandmother's longtime friend, both, had retained Fraser Seitel to be a spokesperson. And here's Fraser saying that when Mr. Rockefeller visits Mrs. Astor, she sits up in bed and kisses him when she sees him. And Fraser's quotes were usually not much longer than that. And here below, Fraser's speaking on behalf of Annette and myself, saying that neither one of us would make any comment until after a hearing, and that was in October. So there's very minimal on the record quotes, largely through Fraser. Meanwhile, there was much communication resulting here and here's just a snippet from my folder on the press. There are over 1,000 pieces from reporters. None of them were syndicated here, starting in July '06. I give you just one example. Serge Kovaleski ended up with some documentation and on the subject painting, my grandmother's favorite painting by Childe Hassam, amazing impressionist painter, and it was her favorite painting. It was over her living room mantelpiece, and she had bequeathed it to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so Serge, in 2 weeks, did amazing investigative reporting, taking what I thought was some pretty bad details and digging deep. And what he found was that my father had not kind of brokered the sale of the painting through his third wife's daughter, who ended up selling the painting to Gerald Peters Gallery in New York, not the same Gerald Peter that has the gallery in Santa Fe. And there are many more details here and in further reporting. A reporter from the Kansas City Star called me up at the time, and I said, okay, it's off the record. He goes, I'm not calling to interview you. I did a deep investigation of Gerald Peters, and let's talk. And so there was much more that came out of that in many directions. Sadly, when my father told his mother that he'd sold the painting, she asked, can I buy dresses? He was trying to convince her that she was going broke. They're down in writing. By the way, everybody knows we're not really made of atoms. We're made of stories. So says Kevin Kelly, a co-founder and executive editor of Wired magazine, in an interview with Amanda Knox recently. Merrill Gordon literally wrote the book on my grandmother's case up to the spoiler alert, the criminal trial. Merrill had been asked by a New York magazine to write a piece about my grandmother. No one knew what had happened to her, understandably, because she'd been so isolated. But in essence, Merrill contacted my father, set up an interview with him, went to his apartment with my father and the third wife and the dog barking every time the third wife got agitated. And my father said, well, I'd rather not speak about my mother. I'd rather talk about myself. And Merrill struggled with this, went back to New York Magazine and says, like, I don't have a piece. There's just nothing here. Well, time went on, and Merrill really had a lead because she'd done this interview. And so New York Magazine contacted Merrill, who was on vacation in Martha's Vineyard, said, Merrill, you've got 48 hours to write a piece. This is really the first piece that went into detail, not about the news at hand, about the guardianship and just the fray, but Merrill did just on the run here, an incredible, insightful piece about the dynamics of my father without really knowing. She didn't know anything about the abuse at that point. My father, my grandmother, their relationship, and it was a great piece. And as a one-off piece, Merrill could have pretty much gone in any direction. But as a result of that, she ended up writing the book, Mrs. Astor Regrets, about my grandmother and presenting it at Rancho Mirage Writers Festival. She's been there a few times. And this book, Mrs. Astor Regrets, Merrill did 230 interviews. And quite frankly, from my point of view, a superb reporting of just the facts with a compelling narrative, and incredible just dig into the insight of the players and very much the psychology. Uh, Merrill, after that, wrote two more books about two women who lived to be over 100. And in this case, Huguette Clark was exploited. And also, Bunny Mellon was exploited to a much less and less chronic uh, case. But that's sort of where Merrill went. She's now off in other regions, having published another book. But in terms of getting this down in writing, my grandmother had an incredible A team around her. Here, her physical therapist, just a month before we got guardianship in her apartment in New York, before we got her really back to the whole goal of this, which I should have mentioned, was to simply get my grandmother back to her country house where she wanted to spend her last days. We didn't know how bad things were until things unraveled, if you will. Alice Purdue, who was my grandmother's secretary in the office, got fired because she kept asking my father why he was asking her to write out checks and for interests that were his, not my grandmother's. And so Alice wrote a really insightful book on her own, Brooke Astor's Court, an insider's story. Probably the most compelling is my grandmother and Chris Ely, who is my grandmother's country butler, if you will, but estate manager in many ways. And here she is in the country in 2003. And if I wouldn't be speaking with you without Chris's involvement. And Chris was so concerned about his boss, his friend, who was getting exploited. And he wrote a piece for the New York City Elder Abuse Center. Um, and I'll let you read it. And for many, writing is so healing. And what Chris went through to get that piece out was amazing, but it helped him along the way. Next, we went from tribulation to trial. We got my grandmother through immediate temporary guardianship in July of '06. And then in October, an out of court settlement, we got permanent guardianship in October of '06. But it took until December for the judge to settle all the finances and beyond. In his decision, he found that petitioner Phillip Marshall was the prevailing party, but he decided that my grandmother's assets should pay for some of my father's legal expenses because based on the court evaluator, oh, here we go. I make this ruling based on the conclusion of the court evaluator that the allegations in the court petition, in the petition regarding Mrs. Astor's medical and dental care and other allegations of intentional elder abuse by the Marshalls were not substantiated. This one clause catapulted us from case to cause. If this held, it would have been open season on seniors. The same month in December that the Judge Stackhausen was making this decision, the Manhattan District Attorney was impaneling a grand jury and issuing subpoenas, resulting in 16 indictments on my father and Francis Morrissey, who was a serial perpetrator, who had insinuated himself into my grandmother's life and who was working with my father. And this is really Robert Morgenthal's last big case when he was district attorney. In 2000, this was in 2007. In April of 2009, the criminal trial began and lasted for 5 months plus 12 days of deliberation by the jury. I had had years to think about the circumstances, and it was through the press that I delivered a message to my father. Please plead and seek forgiveness. The front page editor has it up as "Fess Up, Dad." In October, the verdict was given, and here is John Elligan writing, tracking the court's findings, and John and Amanda really looking beyond the glamour. Astor jury found a moral flaw, and the not just the Times, but the papers really were tracking the pulse of humanity as much as the legal nuances in the court that went on for 5.5 months. Judge Barkley said at the sentencing to my father, "What would your mother say if she were here? Would she blanch at the spectacle? Would she despise you for your breach of trust?" As you know, affluence breeds betrayal when empathy fails. What was a theme in my grandmother's writing leapt out of the page, landed in the courtroom, and ended up being not just a motif there, but an element of the verdict. In 2014, Corey from the Daily News called, and this is what came out. The fact that I first heard the sad news of my father's death from the press speaks volumes about the devastating effect elder abuse can have on families. Briefly, the cause at hand developed because of an enhancement of aging during the mid-20th century, mid-century modernity, where, as I found out as a preservationist, entire communities were destroyed for being Victorian or old. And just as buildings were destroyed, people were discounted. And the result was a reactive campaign of anti-elder abuse, which is only in the last, as we'll see, couple decades, it had been advanced to elder justice and then looked at through a lens of justice. The UN on World Elder Abuse Awareness Day noted that elder abuse is a violation of older people's human rights. And if we're going to look at elder justice through the lens of justice, we have to look at justice through the lens of human rights. Lisa Nirenberger, who came out with Elder Justice, Ageism, Elder Abuse, notes, to me, the recasting of elder abuse as elder justice seems incomplete. It casts freedom from abuse as a right, yet fails to explain how abuse fits into the broader scheme of justice and human rights. I wrote this book to explore that failure. And now Lisa's on to another one, pretty much for lay persons, which is great. So in looking at this segue from elder justice, going up much more toward through the lens of justice, informed by human rights, I think we need to do an iterative assessment. And my feeling is that to be fair on the advancement of elder justice, we need to look at this assessment through the lens of an assessment of guardianship. Guardianship is the appointment by a state court of a person or entity, a corporation, a nursing home, other entities, to make personal and or property decisions for an individual whom the court finds cannot make decisions for themselves. At first, I was speaking nationally in favor of elder justice, in favor of guardianship, because it had helped me. Since then, informed by circumstances in 2022, I have changed my mind. Here, I was awarded, along with Annette de Laurenta, the Isabella, the first Isabella, an award for guardianship by the National College of Probate Judges. But it was in August of 22 when I was one of a dozen witnesses before two New York State senators down in the city. And I had not been victimized, and my grandmother had not been victimized by guardianship. All the other witnesses, all 11, had been devastated by guardianship, and not to speak of the loved ones who they were trying to protect that had been thrown into a guardianship. And so I pivoted. The late Nicholas Luhmann notes that guardianship manifests society's greatest responsibility held in trust, giving courts and guardians broad scope, duties, and the profound asymmetric power imbalance imposed on persons subject to guardianship in the absence of beneficiary control. Erica Wood, who is with American Bar Association Commission on Law and Aging, notes in a piece, guardianship can be a godsend or gulag, a help or hindrance. In our lives, we're so fortunate in having supportive factors, both contextual and individual, interpersonal. So whether we're elders or anyone, our family, friends, and neighbors, those at work, at play, and when we pray, professionals in our greater community can support us in these concentric circles of support informed by Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. This all is off the board when it comes to isolation. And right now, I'm working with a colleague on a funded research on isolation. And it is very fortunate that she's recognized by talking to a lot of interviewees that guardianship is probably the most extreme form of isolation, surgical form of isolation that we have in society. It's also much more in debilitation. A court-appointed plenary, that would be full-time, full scope, permanent guardianship is addressed where instead of having supported, what I call supported independence, we have a dependence by a guardian and the courts. I refer you Rachel Aviv's incredibly written, incredibly researched, incredibly terrifying piece on how elderly lose their rights when a professional guardian walks into their home, wrests them from their house, tosses them into a nursing home, and the pipeline begins. As Mark Andrews notes, guardianship process gives insufficient attention to indispensable constitutional safeguards, such as the rights to equal protection of the laws and due process. The First, Fifth, Sixth, and 14th Amendment are frequently deficient or denied, along with the American with Disabilities Act and Olmstead ruling, and quite frankly, much more. Guardianship is a pipeline for state-enabled white-collar crime. It's very much a network with, as mentioned before, professional guardians, nursing homes, lawyers, the courts included, real estate brokers who sell properties as they before a person under guardianship dies, at times prematurely, with horrible tax consequences and with horrible consequences for the person under guardianship. Uh, the pipeline, this pipeline metaphor highlights a systemic continuity, institutional complicity, even racketeering, and very predictable outcomes for the person under guardianship. Anyone can, in essence, petition for a guardianship, but at the top would be professional guardians, nursing homes and rehab facilities, courts themselves, adult protective services, if only to close out a case, clinicians and evaluators who, through a quick assessment, will write off on incapacity, which triggers guardianship, and many others that you can take a look at if you wish. I don't know how many of you read or saw the subsequent film Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann, which is a tale of the Osage tribe and murders and the birth of the FBI. But the Osage were the richest people per capita of any community when oil was flowing in the early 1900s. And here, as described by David Graham, over the tribe's vehement objections, many Osage, including Lizzie and Anna, were deemed incompetent and were forced to have a local white guardian overseeing and authorizing all of their spending down to the toothpaste they purchased at the corner store. Last year, as part of those trips that you've seen, I visited the Osage tribe, Osage Nation, and here at the Gray Horse Cemetery were a number of Osage who were murdered, quite frankly, were buried. In 2003, I submitted a written statement to the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging, which was addressing guardianship at the time in a hearing on March 30th. But the title of my statement was Guardianships, Conservatives, and Alternatives Statement, Elder Abuse and Financial Exploitation in Adult Guardianship is a State-Sanctioned White-Collar Crime. I then sent this to an assistant U.S. attorney who was also on the white-collar crimes unit and an elder justice coordinator, to which he said, "You were spot on about guardianship, elder abuse." My grandmother received a lot of awards, but she would never want to be called a ward of the state. The same can be said for millions of older adults who are under guardianship today. The National Guardianship Summit notes the terms of ward and incapacitated person, which were rejected by the NGS as demeaning and even offensive, are eliminating a step at a time. But in a proactive eventually preventive way, I recount that elder justice has come of age only in the last 2 decades, 2.5 decades. I asked M.T. Connolly, who was one of the main author of the Elder Justice Act, why'd you call it the Elder Justice Act? We needed to make that change. And here is probably the first time she wrote it at the top of some speaking notes before she went into a meeting in 2002. The act was enacted in 2009 and passed in 2010. And what, in the spirit of this, and this is from M.T. Connolly's great book on the history and players in elder justice, the measure of our age. My campaign here is I've identified as Beyond Guardianship, in part as an echo to my main website, Beyond Brook. Guardianship is barely on the map here through an engram of Google Books up to 2020 or something. And elder abuse is a close second. Then with child abuse and domestic violence, all social harms. You already know that what I'm doing here is saying, if we're going to advance beyond elder justice, we have to look at elder justice through the lens of justice writ large, recognizing, reflecting on Goebel, if you will, that the axiom of a system cannot be defined within its own bounds. We have to go higher. And if we're going to look at elder justice and through the lens of justice, just as a tangent, we have to work with the disability rights community. And the reason we have to do that in large part, is because of rights. We really have to address justice through the lens of rights, but also the disability community is also incredibly impeded by guardianship. And the guardianship pipeline starts before a person is a majority. People are in the guardianship pipeline before they're 18. So here we're going to take a look at an iterative assessment of justice through the lens of rights, and we're going to stress test elder justice by scrutinizing guardianship. What I've done here in my essays, this is where I'm something of an accidental author, is begun a series of essays on Medium here to advance our future selves. And the first one of sort of this series that I'm looking at now, I recognized there needed to be a paradigm shift from reactive stop elder abuse campaigns to proactive preventive elder justice. Next, I took a look at elder justice to create a blueprint for an emerging coalition scaled society-wide. After that, an important element was introduced, as you already know, vital element here in elder justice is the promise of trust. Abuse and exploitation is the ultimate betrayal of trust. And following that, through the Elder Justice Coordinating Council, I submitted a 67-minute read suggesting we can address and arrest adult guardianship abuse by an exploitation as state-sponsored white-collar crime, and how, in concert with the council members. Then I took a look at strengthening elder justice to the point where we are now, really looking at rights and guardianship, I'm going to bring down here, but really cradled by trust with iterative assessments. And lastly, this really addresses aging and ageism, which is really at the forefront of the whole campaign at hand, in a piece that I was making comments as requested by the Administration for Community Living on how to develop a strategic framework for a national plan on aging, which I felt was best viewed through a personal and public framing of our future, envisioned with the lens of both public health and human rights. But the first piece I wrote of all these essays was, as you already know, but for good reason, entitled Press On, recognizing that journalism digs deep to divulge systemic corruption and amplify concerned citizens' calls to action to address and arrest adult guardianship, abuse, and exploitation. In this, which I've updated recently, and that's how I got connected with Leone, um, I basically started with Associated Press in 1987, did a deep investigation I'll get to in the next slide. It resulted in a congressional hearing by Congressman Claude Pepper titled Abuses in Guardianship of the Elderly and Infirm, a National Disgrace. And here, Congressman Pepper is saying, in one short sentence, guardianship, is the most punitive civil penalty that can be levied against an American citizen, with the exception of the death penalty. Here, as one of the witnesses testifying at the conference, was Bill Ahern, managing editor of AP in New York, chronicling, along with the report, which he included, submitted to as evidence, the 2,200 guardianships that they looked at over all 50 states over a year. Just amazing. And you know, those of us in this arena are aiming for a similar report sometime in this decade. Back to Lisa Nirenberg, who says the media has played a major role in highlighting guardianship problems and abuses, going back to the scathing expose by the Associated Press. Next, the LA Times, which I reintroduced this year, which I hadn't in my original essay, Guardians for Profits, 4-part series with 16 follow-up articles. Just to let you know, in this read, which now I've included all it was hard. Most of the papers did not include a listing of all the articles. So I've included all the articles in chronological sequence with, in some cases, in this case, certainly a brief recap of the article. And so you can basically see it's, in essence, a annotated bibliography of all these. And just to let you know, we'll come up to Robin Fields and Jack Leonard with ProPublica in a few minutes. Then I introduced this year, because Diane Diamond, who's an investigative reporter and journalist, and has written books on guardianship for good reason, wrote this. And so I included the Albuquerque Journal's 2016 5-part series, the front page series that Diane did with follow-ups, all sorts of follow-up, and was delighted to basically return to New Mexico on this piece and get introduced to Leone, and included a quote in this section of the Press On. The Tracy Breton, who is a Pulitzer Prize winner, taught at Brown, engaged Brown University's undergraduate students to do, and here I've lined them all up on, I lived in near Rhode Island at the time, front page pieces, incredible 9-part and follow-up series in the Providence Journal in 2018. The Reading Eagle published a 3-day series, and it was spearheaded by Nicole Brambilla, and with some follow-up, which was somewhat stopped in mid-course. And just to put it one way, Nicole left the Reading Eagle shortly after that and went to work for a not-for-profit news agency. It's tough working on this beat, just to let you know. Now we get to 2023. I worked on this last year, 2 years ago, or last year, because of reporting by Samantha Hogan in the Maine Monitor. It was a 6-month investigation and helped me inform a keynote I did in Maine last year, hosted by AARP and Legal Services for Maine Elders. But amazing work by Heather or no, Samantha Hogan. And another series, which I chronicle, is a five-part series by Bloomberg Law. And here's Ronnie Green, who was one of the investigative reporters, in an interview with Katie Barlow, saying, on one hand, rights severely restricted and taken away. On the other hand, no oversight. And that, I think, opens the door for major abuse and neglect. Here, the five parts included the judges, the guardians, lawyers, and a solution. But I have to tell you, what happens is many the solutions have not been made apparent. And I'll mention that in a minute. Now, recently, Jack Pearson for ProPublica did a year-long series and with sort of updates in 2025 on public guardianship in New York, titled The Unbefriended: How New York Fails Its Most Vulnerable. And what happened is ProPublica, two of the investigative reporters with the LA Times, Jack and Robin, are now with ProPublica as editors. So this has sort of come around full circle. My focus in this arena is deep investigative journalism, but also framed in the context of solutions and constructive journalism, both that are slightly different but equally important. And the issue at hand is towards solutions. Is my feeling is law. If I wouldn't be addressing you today if the letter of the law was followed by the courts and all those actors involved in the courts. But the reality, and so I have to presume that we are not going to legislate our way out of guardianship abuse and exploitation, this social impediment, this social harm, that it's going to happen through writing and reporting and deep research and solutions and constructive journalism that recognizes that this is a state endorsed white collar crime. It's perhaps even racketeering, and it needs to be investigated as such. So the Department of Justice and the FBI, which started in on guardianship with the Osage, will come to bear on this. If not this year, hopefully in the future. You remember Samantha? Well, she won the Livingston Award from the University of Michigan last year for her reporting in Maine. And that sort of spurred my investigation into the Fund for Investigative Journalism, which helped fund her along with ProPublica. And now there's a line item in the Fund for Investigative Journalism's budget to help provide seed funding for 2,500 regular grants for 10,000 and or follow-up grants for 2,500 to reporters who want to investigate guardianship, abuse, and exploitation. And so I think it's really helpful to work with national organizations here, but also the investigative reporters and editors that have profound resources on, for example, investigative skills. And in this case, the last piece on investigative skills that have helped inform guardianship were written by the reporters for the LA Times series in 2005, here in 2006, talking in the RE Journal about the steep learning curve for the series of stories on guardianship care for the state's elderly that you have seen, and recognizing that the series unleashed an outpouring of outrage from readers. Claude Pepper, Congressman Pepper, at the conclusion of his hearing in 1987, had to muse, I wonder if they'll get me. I'm 87. I have to be on the alert. It is my hope and that of many others that we will go beyond guardianship, that in the OED, in the not too far future, that we'll have adult guardianship as an obsolete term. If you would hit the mark, you must aim a little above it. Every arrow that flies feels the attraction of Earth. Grounded by the gravity of guardianship. Let's aim high. Let's hit the mark. And let's start with writing. Thank you.
Well, Philip, I want to give you one more round of applause. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Very interesting presentation.